Hello, my name is Jessie Mercer, and today I am going to be taking you through a podium pathway to golf's majors. So in golf, golf was introduced to the Olympics again after 100 years in 2016. So we have two Olympic cycles with the game in the modern era. Unfortunately, those Olympics have not yet attracted the top players in the world, particularly on the men's side, and the major championships still remain the pinnacle of success or that podium result that we work towards our whole life. So for the purpose of this project, I'm going to continue to use majors as that podium result that we are working towards throughout the course of our development. So first, I'm going to take you through Golf Canada's long-term player development model. On the left, you'll see the stages of development that we do see very similar to other sports. The main thing to note here is the difference between men and women. So the men are developing a little bit later, taking a little bit more time through each stage of development, where the girls tend to progress pretty quickly. Now, these ages are pretty heavily disputed within the industry. They argue that the entrance to that intro to competition in particular happens quite a bit earlier than is indicated here. For example, we did see a 12-year-old this year qualify for the Women's US Open, a professional event. In Canada alone, we had a 12-year-old boy come runner-up at the Canadian Junior Boys. So of course, ages are just a guideline. But the key things to note here are kind of that difference in that compete to win stage, which for the purposes of this is typically when these players are making the transition to professional golf from amateur golf. This train to compete, learn to compete stage is what we're going to use as our top level amateur players. And then this intro to competition side, again, more at that provincial local level, and maybe a couple national events here in that learn to compete. On the right-hand side here, we have our competitive pathway, how it relates specifically to the Canadian golf landscape. So we have, just similar to other things, local, regional, provincial, national, and international championships. So again, these national and international championships here, having at that train to compete, learn to compete stage. Now, this is Golf Canada's performance trajectory model. So there are a couple of interesting things to note here within this model. Again, the difference between men and women. So again, we have that turn pro stage at 22 on the men's side, 19 on the girls' side. And then we have that projection again to the major being that pinnacle of success or that podium result that we are working towards. So on the men's side, we can see that's about 10 years between that transition to professional golf to winning that first major. And on the women's side, we're looking at about 7 years. I'm going to dig into this a little bit more with the data that I've collected and show kind of that this is a kind of a long trajectory when we're looking at the top players in the world. Now, at this compete at the world amateur events here and here, where we're about 15, 16 on the girls' side, 17 to 21 on the girls' side, that's what I'm going to use as when a player, assume this is when a player earns their first WAGR ranking. So WAGR, W-A-G-R, is the World Amateur Golf Rankings. We are lucky in golf to have a very sophisticated amateur golf ranking system. It was revamped in about 2008 to 2010, and it does a really good job of capturing the top amateurs before they make the transition to professional golf from around the world. It is actually very hard to become WAGR ranked. You need to either win a high-level amateur event or come very high in one of those highly ranked WAGR events. For a lot of kids on a provincial or national team within Canada, their goal is often just to get a WAGR ranking and then begin that process of moving up the WAGR ranks, getting into more events, etc. So again, we're looking at about, on the girls' side, about 10 years out from earning that first WAGR ranking to when they win that major. And on the boys' side, it's a little bit more here. We have about 15 years between that first WAGR rank and that first major. Okay, so now we're going to dive into some data that I've pulled from some of the top players in the world. So here we have our top 13 men and 10 women on the Rolex rankings. And this is as of November 1st. Maybe a little bit different as you're watching this today, but that's okay for the purpose of what we're doing here. So there are two things that I'm predominantly looking at. At the exit, at that pinnacle of success being that winning a major. There are some people, and with golf, you can be ranked very highly in the world without winning a major. So someone like Patrick Cantlay or Xander Schauffele have not won one of golf's majors at this point. So we're not going to include them in the data. On the other side, one of the important things I'm looking at is that entrance to the pathway is that first WAGR ranking. And as I said, it was kind of sophisticated in the early 2010s. So people that turned pro before that, I don't want to include in this because I am not able to accurately track their success as an amateur. So for that reason, I'm going to take out people like Inbee Park, who's been pro since the early 2000s, and Louis Oosthuizen, who turned pro in 2002. So when we take out those two factors, we're left with these two lists of 6 players on the men's side and 6 players on the women's side. And of course, always nice to note that we have a Canadian in the top 10 who is 6 on this list in Brooke Henderson. So I'm going to dive into these 6 players, both men and women, looking at their trajectory from their first WAGR rank to winning their first major. So here we're looking at the men's side. So here are the data points that I've collected on this path to golf's major. So first we have that first WAGR rank. So that's how many years before they won their major they became ranked. Then we have that date they turned pro. Again, in golf, you actually turn professional, you declare that you are now professional and you can collect money. So anyone we see on TV typically is a professional athlete, professional golfer, they're able to accept sponsors, they're no longer allowed to compete for school or any of that. So this is the date that they actually turn professional, how many years out from the first major. Here's their first pro win. So to get it to the PGA Tour or the LPGA Tour, which is typically where players are playing when they win their majors, not always, of course, you have to qualify through one of golf's other affiliate tours. So on the PGA Tour, that could be the Korn Ferry Tour, PGA Tour Canada, PGA Tour Latin America, and others. So there are these systems of developmental pro tours, and we're going to look at the first time that they've won on a developmental pro tour as one of these stages of success. Again, seeing if they can translate that amateur success into winning as a professional when money and other things are on the line. From that first pro win, then we're going to look at that first PGA Tour win, the first time that they win on golf's major stage. And then, of course, the first time that they win a major golf championship, where there are 4 on the men's side per year. So now let's look at this. It's pretty consistent that between getting their first WAGR rank and turning pro, it's about 5.5 years. And we see this pretty consistently throughout everyone. So when we look at this, it's interesting as well when we look at these 6 athletes to note that all 6 of these athletes were actually ranked in the top 10 on WAGR when they did turn professional. So again, they've had some major success at the amateur level, and when they're making that jump, it's argued that they're ready. They've reached the pinnacle of amateur golf and they're ready to make that success. So what they could have been doing in here on the men's side, typically playing a lot of NCAA golf, we are seeing that still remains the path on the men's side, but they're spending about 5.5 years playing high-level amateur golf before making that transition to professional golf. The other thing that's interesting when we look at the top male players in the world is how quickly they actually won once turning professional. So you can see here within about a year, less than a year, they're winning as a professional. And most of the time this is on one of those developmental tours, as there's no direct path to the PGA Tour. There was prior to 2017, and that's actually what we see with Jordan Spieth. He was the last graduating class to have that direct tour path to tour through Q School. But everyone else is winning on one of these developmental tours within about a year and a half. And then, of course, the success on these developmental tours leads into the professional tour. And within a little over a year of turning professional, they are winning on the PGA Tour. And then about 3 years between there and winning a major. So this transition is pretty quick, being able to turn professional with professional level, win on tour. And then we're seeing again a gap between getting that experience and actually winning that major. So in all, it's about a 10-year path between that first WAGR rank and winning their first major. And we got about 3 years between that first PGA Tour win and that first major win. Okay, so now I'm going to look at the girls' side. So the girls' side, we actually see a pretty similar path. The middle looks a little bit sticky, and I'll get into that in a minute. But the interesting biggest difference between the men and the women's side is the period of time here spent on as an amateur. So where the men spent about 5.5 to 6 years as an amateur, we're seeing the girls spend less than 3. There's a few reasons we can look at this within the game. If we look at some of the Asian countries who are fairly dominant on the LPGA Tour, their system of development really encourages turning pro earlier, getting that experience as a professional early, and kind of the way they see it, not looking at spending a lot of time as an amateur when they know that they have the talents and the skills to succeed as a pro, getting that experience right off the bat. So that could be part of the reason why we see this a lot smaller. And you also can see that in the fact that Jin Young Ko, who is our #1 player in the world right now, actually was ranked over 200th on WAGR when she made the transition to pro. So again, it could be indicating that her team around her knew that she had talent, even though she was ranked over 200th. But they knew that if she turned professional, she could spend that time at the professional level having success. And now she's the #1 player in the world, so it paid off. So again, we're seeing about 2 years between turning professional and earning that first WAGR rank. So about 2 years at the high level amateur. Now you see a lot of up and downs here. And when we look at someone like Brooke Henderson and Lydia Ko, both won professional events as amateurs. And that's why we see this line higher here. This may seem like an anomaly and that it would only impact the top players in the world, but on the women's side, this is actually not that uncommon. We have a girl in Thailand right now, Atata Tadiko, who actually just won a Thai professional event as a 17-year-old amateur. We also see our high-level amateurs being able to compete with the professionals at a much stronger rate than we do on the men's side. We had 14 girls qualify, 14 amateur women qualify for the US Open this year and compete strongly within those amateurs. If you watch the Women's US Open this year, it was very exciting. There was a 17-year-old Megan Gane who was within a couple shots of the lead coming into Sunday. So of course, while it may seem like an anomaly, we are seeing that women on the women's side, they are testing themselves with the professionals before actually making that transition to professional. And again, that could be why they're more ready to make that jump. They kind of win within a year or in that same year that they turn pro. Minji Lee, Nelly Korda won within a year of turning pro. Same with Jin Young Ko, sorry. So this transition is very quick. And again, in the Asian countries, they have a very sophisticated professional circuit that leads them to the LPGA Tour. So they have the Korean LPGA, the Japan LPGA. So again, that opportunity for them to win at home and not make the jump to the LPGA Tour until they are ready, until they are winning on those professional tours in Asia. And then that's probably why we see a little bit of a bigger gap here, kind of 1.5 years where it was about 2 years where it was a little bit shorter on the men's side. So again, 2 years, 3 years to turn professional, and then another 2 years between turning professional and winning on the LPGA Tour. And then again, this is pretty similar to the men's side, where within 2.5 years, you're winning your first major. So again, of course, there are exceptions, but for the most part, that's where we have. So we have someone like Yuka Sasso, turned professional, won, and then of course her first win was actually a major. You've got someone like Minji Lee, who turned professional, was actually the #1 amateur in the world, some success right away, but then 6 years between turning pro, between winning that first LPGA event and actually winning a major. We see the same thing with the men's side. So some of the anomalies here, we of course have Hideki Matsuyama, the 2021 Master Champion. Everything was pretty consistent with the baseline here, 5 years as an amateur, one within a year, one on the PGA Tour within a year, but then 7 years to win that first major breakthrough. We do know that he was competing very well and very strongly in this time. However, he just hadn't made that breakthrough to actually win a major. Again, on the other side, you have Colin Morikawa, who did everything very, very quickly. Won immediately after turning pro on a sponsor's exemption, which got him PGA Tour status for the next year, which then, of course, he won the major. So we are seeing that these top players are actually going through this a lot faster than we expect. So here's the gender comparison between the women and the men. Quite a bit more close together than I had actually expected. And again, we can see this biggest gap is just this area here, the amount of time they're spending as an amateur. But then through here, you know, winning within a year, winning on tour within 2 years, and then winning that first major within 4 years of turning professional. So now I want to compare the data I've collected from this top echelon of golfers to the Golf Canada predictions. So they were actually pretty accurate with the amount of time spent as an amateur, 5 years on the men's side, 4 years, maybe a little bit longer than expected on the women's side. But the biggest difference is the 10 years here between turning pro and winning a first major and the 7 years here. So this could be very indicative of the Canadian golf system we're seeing here. In the year that Brooke Henderson turned professional in 2014, she was the #1 amateur in the world. She followed this exact path, went on to win within a year of turning professional, and then won her first major within 2. However, we actually had 4 girls in the top 50 of WAGR within that time. And of course, people fall off and the funnel gets smaller, but we only had one of those 4, sorry, excluding Brooke. So there was Brooke plus 4, so 5 total. So only one of those 4 girls actually won as a professional. None of them won on the LPGA Tour, and none of them are playing anymore. So this path is actually quite a bit extended in what we're looking at from Canadians. So maybe looking at how we make that transition to professional golf and win right away is something we need to look at in our system. But again, aside from that, the system is pretty consistent across the men and the women, and we're doing a very good job in Canada of getting our amateur golfers ranked. It's this step here that we need to work on. So just a couple conclusions to draw from this. Obviously, as I mentioned, men spend a little bit more time as an amateur before making the jump to professional golf. We can see this in the system with most men finishing college, going through the NCAA system before making the turn to pro, and women either choosing not to go to college or turn pro early and leave college early. So again, those men are spending about 5.5, 6 years as an amateur, where the women are only spending 3. And again, this Golf Canada performance trajectory is very similar on the amateur side, but just it's actually a much quicker projection from turning pro to actually winning one of those majors than we're projecting in Canada that we see in those top players. And then, of course, turning pro to our first major, about 4 years on both the women's side and the men's side, which I was a little bit surprised about that it was so similar with men and women. I think we expect the men's trajectory to be a lot longer, but when we look at the actual top players in the world, it is fairly quick. It's about 4 years. And again, both men and women are making that jump to professional golf pretty quickly. They turn pro, they win on the LPGA Tour or PGA Tours within 2 years. They're not spending a lot of time in those developmental tours. That's all I have for today. I want to thank you for listening. Let me know if you have any questions, and I look forward to digging more into this as we go into the next project and really digging into kind of that transition from the amateur to the professional ranks and what those players are actually doing as an amateur before they turn pro, and then in their early pro days to project those majors. So that's going to be the next thing I personally want to dig into, but I appreciate your time, and we'll see you soon.